The way I have this set up is that I don't have the. I took it off the mount over here, and I just placed it onto the laptop. Luckily, it's magnetic. So, that little touching spot, I accidentally turned off the AI tracking. So yeah, we'll continue on with Hillbilly Elegy by Vice President Vance. Alright, let's hope the book won't get in the way. Alright. Now that page will permanently be bent. That's how I had to bookmark it, since I don't have a bookmark of my own. Oh, I didn't move my microphone. Hang on. I hate getting this out. Okay. Alright, let's start. Chapter 2. Hillbillies like to add their own twist to many worlds. We call minnows minners, and crayfish crawdads. Hollow is defined as a valley or basin. But I've never said the word hollow unless I've had to explain to a friend what I mean when I say holler. Holler. And by the way, I'm looking up here, I'm looking at myself in the screen. Here, let me show you. I'm looking at myself here on Streamlabs. it's so odd. I can't get over this setup. I really should keep it on the mount to keep it from breaking. But I think this isn't as fragile as the Spot Tiny 2. Other people have all kinds of names for their grandparents. Grandpa, Nana, Pop-Pop, Granny, and so on. Maybe not spelt like that. I.e. Yet I've never heard anyone say mama pronounced mam-aw, or papa outside of our community. These names belong only to hillbilly grandparents. My grandparents, mama and papa, were, without question or qualification, the best things that ever happened to me. They spent the last 2 decades of their lives showing me the value of love, stability, and teaching me the life lesson that most people learn from their parents. Both did their part to ensure that I lost where I was. Both did their part to ensure that I had the self-conscious confidence and the right opportunities to get a fair shot at the American dream. But I doubt that. As children, Jim Vance and Bonnie Blanton ever expected much out of their own lives. How could they? Appalachian Hills and single-room K-12 schoolhouses don't tend to foster big dreams. I hope this can distract me from the whole stuff between my parents. They're having disagreements, if you want to know. We don't know much about Papa's early years, and I doubt that will ever change. We do know that he was something of hillbilly royalty. Papa's distant cousin, also Jim Vance, married into the Hatfield family and joined a group of former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers called the Wildcats. While Cousin Jim murdered former Union soldier Asa Harmon McCoy, he kicked off one of the most famous family feuds in American history. Papa was born James Lee Vance in 1929. He'd be about 95. His middle name, a tribute to his father Lee Vance. Lee died just a few months after Papa's birth. So Papa's overwhelmed mother, Goldie, sent him to live with her father, Pap Twalby, I guess that's how it's said. Sorry, I had this crap on my lips. Here's my chapstick. I don't have any Kleenexes or anything in here. A strict man with a small timber business. Though Goldie sent money occasionally, she rarely visited her young son. Papa would live with Talby in Jackson, Kentucky, for the first 17 years of his life. Pap Talby had a tiny two-room house just a few hundred yards from the Blantons. Blaine and Hattie and their 8 children. Hattie felt sorry for the young motherless boy and became a surrogate mother to my grandfather. Jim soon became an extra member of the family. He spent most of his free time running around with the Blanton boys, and he ate most of his meals in Hattie's kitchen. It was only natural that he'd eventually marry her oldest daughter. Jim married into a rowdy crew. The Blantons were a famous group in Breathitt. That's the county, remember? And they had a feuding history nearly as illustrious illustrious, that's how it's said, as Papa's. Mammal's great-grandfather had been elected county judge at the beginning of the 20th century, but only after her grandfather, Tilden, the son of the judge, killed a member of a rival family on election day. And I guess that's another quote, since it has the number 2 by it. And there's a number 3 later on. In the New York Times story about the violent feud, 2 things leap out. The first is that Tilden never went to jail for the crime, and there's a 3 there. So let me see. Later on, is there some citations or something? There's the afterword. I won't read that. Acknowledgements. Notes. Okay. That's what those are. Those are the citations, because there's notes at the end. The second is that, as times expected, complications were expected. I would imagine so. When I first read this gruesome story in one of the country's most circulated newspapers, I felt one emotion above all the rest: pride. Put this back. Where was I? Where's pride at? It's unlikely that any other ancestor of mine has ever appeared in the New York Times. If they had, I doubt that any deed would make me as proud as a successful feud. And and one that could have swung an election, no less. As Mamaw used to say, you you can take the boy out of Kentucky, but you can't take Kentucky out of the boy. Yeah. You could take me out of Arkansas, but you can't take Arkansas out of me. I still support Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I'll be voting for her next year in the midterms. Where was I? I can't imagine what Papa was thinking. Mama came from a family that would shoot at you rather than argue with you. Her father was a scary old hillbilly with the mouth and war medals of a sailor. Her grandfather's murderous exploits were impressive enough to make pages of the New York Times. And as scary as her lineage was, Mama Bonnie herself was so terrifying that many decades later, a Marine Corps recruiter would tell me that I'd find boot camp easier than living at home. Those drill instructors are mean, he said, but not like that grandma of yours. Really? Drill sergeants aren't even that bad? Oh, man. That meanness wasn't enough to dissuade my grandfather, so Mama and Papa were married as teenagers in Jackson in 1947. Yeah, if you're 16 or 17, you can get married, but you have to have your parents' consent. That's how Nana Heath and Papa Heath are married. They got married at a younger age. At that time, as post-World War II euphoria wore off and people began to adjust to a world at peace, there were two types of people in Jackson. Those who uprooted their lives and planted them in the industrial powerhouses of the new America, and those who didn't. At the tender ages of 14 and 17, my grandparents had to decide which group to join. As Papa once told me, the sole option for many of his friends was to work in the mines, mining coal, not far from Jackson. Oh, come on, don't skip a page. Those who stayed in Jackson spent their lives on the edge of poverty, if not submerged in it. So, soon after marrying, Papa uprooted his young family to move to Middletown, a small Ohio town with a rapidly growing industrialized economy. This is the story my grandparents told me, and like most family legends, it's largely true, but plays fast and loose with the details. On a recent trip to visit family in Jackson, my great-uncle Arch, Mamaw's brother-in-law and the last of that generation of Jacksonians, introduced me to Bonnie South, a woman who spent all of her 84 years 100 yards from Mamaw's childhood home, until Mamaw left for Ohio. Bonnie South was her best friend, and Bonnie South's reckoning, Mamaw and Papa's departure involved a bit more scandal than any of us realized. In 1946, Bonnie South and Papa were lovers. I'm not sure what this meant in Jackson at the time. Whether they were preparing for an engagement or just passing the time together. Bonnie had little to say of Papa, besides the fact that he was very handsome. The only other thing Bonnie South recalled was that, at some point in 1946, Papa cheated on Bonnie with her best friend, Mamaw. Mamaw was 13 and Papa was 16. But the affair produced a pregnancy, and that pregnancy added a number of pressures that made right now the time to leave Jackson. My intimidating, grizzled war veteran great-grandfather the Blanton brothers, who had already earned a reputation for defending Mamaw's honor, and an interconnected group of gun-toting hillbillies who immediately knew all about Bonnie Blanton's pregnancy. Most important, Bonnie and Jim Vance would soon have another mouth to feed before they'd gotten used to feeding themselves. Mama and Papa left abruptly for Dayton, Ohio, where they lived briefly before settling permanently in Middletown. Hold on, I'm gonna get that back pillow. Okay. I got it. And it lost me. I'm up here. Okay, still not following me. Wow, it's completely focused on the microphone. Let me reset it. Never mind. Alright. Here's the book. I don't need my headphones, technically. What am I listening to? In later years, Mama sometimes spoke of a daughter who died in infancy. She led us all to believe that the daughter was born sometime after Uncle Jimmy, Mama, and Papa's eldest child. Mama suffered 8 miscarriages in the decade between Uncle Jimmy's birth and my mother's. 8? Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Oh man. But recently my sister discovered a birth certificate for infant Vance, the aunt I never knew, who died so young that the birth certificate also lists her date of death. The baby who brought my grandparents to Ohio didn't survive her first week. On that birth certificate, the baby's broken-hearted mother lied about her age. Only 14 at the time, with a 17-year-old husband. If you're younger than 16, you have to have a court order to be able to get married at that point. Come on, what is wrong with this? Where am I? She couldn't tell the truth, lest they ship her back to Jackson or send Papa to jail. Yeah, Mama's first foray into adulthood ended in tragedy. Today I often wonder, without the baby, would she ever have left Jackson? Would she have run off with Jim Vance to a foreign territory? Mama's entire life, and the trajectory of our family, may have changed for a baby who lived only 6 days. Whatever mix of economic opportunity and family necessity. Hang on, let me turn off the gestures entirely, since I don't think they're gonna help ever. Now I can do that without having to suffer. Where was I? Whatever mix of economic opportunity and family necessity catapulted my grandparents to Ohio, that they were there, and there was no going back. So Papa found a job at Armco, a large steel company that aggressively recruited in eastern Kentucky coal country. Armco representatives would descend on towns like Jackson and promise, truthfully, a better life for those willing to move north and work in the mills. A special policy encouraged wholesale migration. Applicants with a family member working at Armco would move to the top of the employment list. Armco didn't just hire the young men of Appalachian Kentucky. They were actively encouraging those men to bring their extended families. Wow. A number of industrial firms employed a similar strategy, and it appears to have worked. During that era, there were many Jacksons and many Middletowns. I thought I would say Jacksonians and Middletownians or something. I wonder what you call someone from Hot Springs or Little Rock. Little Rockers. Most likely that's what they're called. During that era, there were many. Oh, yeah. Researchers have documented two major waves of migration from Appalachia to the industrial powerhouse economies in the Midwest. The first happened after World War One, when returning veterans found it nearly impossible to find work in the not yet industrialized mountains of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Yeah, because World War One, it had recruiting through the roof during the war, and then when it ended, all the stuff that was there was gone. Black people in the workforce, women in the workforce, a whole bunch of jobs. It was all gone. It ended as the Great Depression hit northern economies hard. Number 4, another citation. My grandparents were part of the second wave, composed of returning veterans and the rapidly rising number of young adults in 1940s and 50s. Appalachia. Number 5, another, what is wrong with my index finger? Another citation. As the economies of Kentucky and West Virginia lagged behind those of their neighbors, the mountains that had only two products that the industrial economies of the North needed, coal and hill people, and Appalachia exported a lot of both. Precise numbers are tough to pin down because studies typically measure net out immigration, as in the total number of people who left minus the number of people who came in. Many families constantly traveled back and forth, which skews the data. But it is certain that many millions of people traveled along the Hillbilly Highway. They talking about the migrant workers, not the illegal immigrants. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about during the Great Depression, when people worked in the farms, and then they were paid after a certain amount of time, and then most of the people, they just waste all that money in cat houses. Don't look up what a cat house is. You don't want to know. Where was I? As total number left minus the number of people who came in. Many families constantly traveled back and forth, which skews the oh yeah. A metaphorical term that captured the opinion of Northerners who saw their cities and towns flooded with people like my grandparents. The scale of the migration was staggering. In the 1950s, 13 of every 100 Kentucky residents migrated out of the state. Some areas saw even greater immigration. I just lost the hat. Hey, are you kidding me? Why do you always get lost? Why are you trying to look at Bowser? No, that just resets the position. That really doesn't help. Bowser has nothing to do with this, okay? This has nothing to do with Mario. Hang on. Okay, I think it's centered. Alright, where was I? Oh, yeah, immigration. That's not the immigration word I'm used to. With an E right by my finger here. It's odd. Harlan County, for example, which was brought to fame in an Academy Award-winning documentary about coal strikes, lost 30% of its population to migration. In 1960, of Ohio's 10 million residents, 1 million were born in Kentucky, West Virginia, or Tennessee. This doesn't count the large number of migrants from elsewhere in the southern Appalachian Mountains, nor does it include the children and grandchildren of migrants who were hill people to the core. There were undoubtedly many of these children and grandchildren, as hillbillies tended to have higher birth rates than the native population. Another citation, number 6. In short, my grandparents. Why am I sensing deja vu? Seriously, I am sensing too much deja vu right now. Is God trying to show me something? In short, my grandparents' experience was extremely common. Significant parts of an entire region picked up shop and moved north. Need more proof? Hop on a northbound highway in Kentucky or Tennessee the day after Thanksgiving or Christmas. And virtually every license plate you see comes from Ohio, Indiana, or Michigan. Cars full of hillbilly transplants returning home for the holidays. Mama's family participated in the migratory flow with gusto. Of her seven siblings, Pet, Paul, and Gary moved to Indiana and worked in construction. Each owned a successful business and worked considerable wealth in the process. Rose, Betty, Tiberi, and David stayed behind. All of them struggled financially, though everyone but David, is that where he got David for his new middle name? Though everyone but David managed a life of relative comfort by the standards of their standard community. The 4 who left died on a significantly higher rung of the socio-economic ladder than the 4 who stayed. As Papa knew when he was a young man, the best way up for the hillbilly was out. It was probably uncommon for my grandparents to be alone in their new city. But if Mama and Papa were isolated from their family, they were hardly segregated from Middletown's broader population. Most of the city's inhabitants had moved there for work in the new industrial plants, and most of these new workers were from Appalachia. The family-based hiring practices of the major industrial firms, quotation 7, had their desired effect, and the results. By the way, I don't know how long these chapters are. I'm not going to look ahead like I did with chapter 1. Were predictable. All over the industrial Midwest, new communities of Appalachian transplants and their families sprang up. Virtually out of nowhere, as one study noted, migration did not so much destroy neighborhoods and families as transport them. Quotation 8. Or citation 8. In 1950s Middletown, my grandparents found themselves in a situation both new and familiar. New because they were, for the first time, cut off from the extended Appalachian support network on which they were accustomed. Familiar because they were still surrounded by hillbillies. I'd like to tell how my grandparents thrived in their new environment, how they raised a successful family, and how they retired comfortably, middle class. But that is a partial truth. Probably the lowest middle class. Way lower than what Kamala Harris will say she is. Definitely, definitely. That crazy old bitch. The full truth is that my grandparents struggled in their new life, as they continued to do so for decades. For starters, a remarkable stigma. Oh gosh, I hate that word. I don't understand why people even use stigma. It makes no sense. A remarkable stigma attached to people who left the hills of Kentucky for a better life. Hillbillies have a phrase, too big for your britches, to describe those who think they're better than the stock they came from. For a long time after my grandparents came to Ohio, they heard exactly that phrase from the people back home. From people back home, the sense that they had abandoned their families was acute, and it was expected that, whatever their responsibilities, they had returned home regularly. This pattern was common among Appalachian migrants. More than 9 in 10 would make visits home during the course of their lives, and more than 1 in 10 visited about once a month. Citation 9. My grandparents returned to Jackson often, sometimes on consecutive weekends, despite the fact that the trip in the 1950s required about 20 hours of driving. I was about to question how far those two places are. Economic mobility came with with a lot of pressures, and it came with a lot of new responsibilities. That stigma came from both directions. Many of their new neighbors viewed them suspiciously. People keep coming and going, I don't know why. To the established middle class of white Ohioans, that's odd, these hillbillies simply don't belong. They had too many children, and they welcomed their extended families into their homes for too long. On several occasions, thought I heard something. On several occasions, Mama's brothers and sisters lived with her and Papa for months as they tried to find good work outside of the hills. In other words, many parts of their culture and customs met with roaring disapproval from native Middletownians. As one book, Appalachian Odyssey, notes about the influx of hill people to Detroit, it was not simply that the Appalachian migrants, as rural strangers out of place in the city, were upsetting the Midwestern urban whites. Rather, these migrants disrupted a broad set of assumptions held by northern whites about how white people appeared, spoke, and behaved. The disturbing aspect of hillbillies was their racialness. Ostensibly, they were the same racial order, whites, as those who dominated economic, political, and social power in local and national arenas. But hillbillies shared many regional characteristics with the southern blacks arriving in Detroit. Citation 10. One of Papa's good friends, a hillbilly from Kentucky, whom he met in Ohio, became a mail carrier in their neighborhood. Not long after he moved, the mail carrier got embroiled in a battle with the Middletown government over the flock of chickens that he kept in his yard. He treated them just as Mama had treated her chickens back in the holler. Every morning he collected all the eggs. When his chicken population grew too large, he'd take a few of the old ones, wring their necks, and carve them for meat right in his backyard. You could just imagine a well-bred housewife watching out the window in horror as their Kentucky-born neighbor slaughtered squawking chickens just a few feet away. I don't want to think about that. Oh God. My sister and I my sister and I still call the old mail carrier the Chicken Man. And years later, even a mention of how the city government ganged up on the Chicken Man could inspire Mama's traditional vitriol. Fucking zone laws. They can kiss my ruby red asshole. Jeez. They can move. The move to Middletown created other problems as well. In the mountain homes of Jackson, privacy was more theory than practice. Family, friends, and neighbors would barge into your home without much warning. Mothers would tell their daughters how to raise their children. Children and chickens are different. What am I saying? Gosh. Can't read this right. Where was I? Oh yeah. Fathers would tell sons how to do their jobs. Brothers would tell brothers-in-law how to treat their wives. Family life was something people on the fly with a lot of help from their neighbors. I think I read that wrong. Family life was something people learned on the fly with a lot of help from their neighbors. There. I read that right that time. In Middletown, a home... why do I keep skipping words and mixing them together? A man's home was his castle. However, that castle was empty for Mama and Papa. They brought an ancient family structure from the hills and tried to make it work in a world of privacy and nuclear families. They were newlyweds, but they didn't have anyone to teach them about marriage. They were parents, but there was no grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins to help them with the workload. The only nearby close relative was Papa's mother, Goldie. She was mostly a stranger to her own son. Mama couldn't have held her in lower esteem for abandoning him. After a few years, Mama and Papa began to adapt. Mama became close friends with the neighbor lady. That was her word for the neighbors she liked, who lived in the nearby apartment. Papa worked on cars in his spare time, and his co-workers slowly turned from colleagues to friends. In 1951, they welcomed a baby boy. My Uncle Jimmy. And showered him with their new material comforts. Jimmy, Mama would tell me later, could sit up at 2 weeks, walk at 4 months, speak in complete sentences just after his first birthday, and read classic novels by the age of 3. A slight exaggeration, my uncle later admitted. They visited Mama's brothers in Indianapolis and picnicked with their new friends. It was, Uncle Jimmy told me, a typical middle-class life. Kind of boring by some standards, but happy in a way you appreciate only when you understand the consequences of not being boring. which is not to say that things always proceeded smoothly. Once they traveled to the mall to buy Christmas presents with the holiday throng and let Jimmy roam so he could locate a toy he conveyed. I think I read that wrong. Coveted. They were advertising it on TV, he told me recently. It was a plastic console that looked like a dash of a jet fighter plane. You could shine a light or shoot darts. The whole idea was to pretend that you were a fighter pilot. Jimmy wandered into a pharmacy that happened to sell the toy, so he picked it up and began to play with it. The store clerk wasn't happy. He told me to put the toy down and get out. Chattest. Young Jimmy stood outside in the cold until Mama and Papa strolled by and asked if he'd like to go inside the pharmacy. I think I read that wrong. I can't, Jimmy told his father. I don't know how you say that word, really. Why? I just can't. Tell me why right now. He pointed at the store clerk. That man got mad at me and told me to leave. I'm not allowed to go back inside. Mama and Papa stormed in, demanding an explanation for the store clerk's rudeness. The clerk explained that Jimmy had been playing with an expensive toy. This toy? Papa asked, picking up the toy. When the clerk nodded, Papa smashed it on the ground. The book closed on me. You gotta be kidding me. I lost my grip. At least I remember the page. Haha. Utter chaos ensued. As Uncle Jimmy explained, they went nuts. Dad threw another one of the toys across the store and moved toward the clerk in a very menacing way. Mom started grabbing random shit off the shelves and throwing it all over the place. She's screaming, "Kick his fucking ass! Kick his fucking ass!" She screamed. Okay, and then Dad leans into this clerk and says very clearly, "If you say another word to my son, I will break your fucking neck." This poor guy was completely terrified. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The man apologized, and the Vances continued with their Christmas shopping as if nothing had happened. Reminding me of a scene in Hillbilly Elegy, the movie. So yes, even in their best times, Mama and Papa struggled to adapt. Middletown was a very different world. Papa was supposed to go to work and complained politely to management about rude pharmacy employees. Mama was expected to cook dinner, do laundry, and take care of the children. But sewing circles, picnics, and door-to-door vacuum salesmen were not suited to a woman who had almost killed a man at a tender age of 12. Mama had little help when the children were young and required constant supervision. She had nothing else to do with her time. Decades later, she would remember how isolated she felt in the slow suburban crawl of mid-century Middletown. Of that era, she said with characteristic bluntness, women were just shit on all the time. Oh gosh. Mama had her dreams, but never the opportunity to pursue them. And I'm not intentionally trying to say the words twice, okay? I'm not intentionally trying to do that. I'm just trying to read it like it says, okay? Because sometimes I mess up. Mama had her dream. Oh yeah. Her greatest love was children. in both a specific sense. Her children and grandchildren were the only things in the world she seemed to enjoy in old age. Um, and a general one, she watched shows about abused, neglected, and missing children, and used what little spare money she had to purchase shoes and school supplies from the neighborhood's poorest children. She seemed to feel the pain of neglected kids in a deeply personal way and spoke often of how she hated people who mistreated children. I never understood where this sentiment came from, whether she herself was abused as a child, perhaps, or whether she just regretted that her childhood had ended so abruptly. There is a story there, though uh, though I'll likely never hear it. Mama dreamed of turning that passion into a career as a children's attorney, serving as a voice for those who lacked one. She never pursued that dream, possibly because she didn't know what becoming an attorney took. Mama never spent a day in high school. She'd given birth to and buried a child before she could legally drive a car. Even if she'd known what was required, her new lifestyle offered little encouragement or opportunity for an aspiring law student with 3 children and a husband. Despite the setbacks, both my grandparents had an almost religious faith and hard work in the American dream. Neither was under any illusions that wealth or privilege didn't matter in America. On politics, for example, Mama had one opinion: they're all a bunch of crooks. But Papa became a committed Democrat. Yeah, like a lot of people are today. They're too committed to being Democrats, even though they know they're wrong, but they still want to stand for the Democrats, even though they're killing us all. And some people, like Dad, just thinks they're all idiots for no reason. He had no problem with Armco, but he and everyone like him hated the coal companies in Kentucky thanks to a long history of labor strife. So, to Papa and Mama, not all rich people were bad, but all bad people were rich. But Papa was a Democrat because that party protected the working people. This attitude carried over to Mama. All politicians might be crooks, but if there were any exceptions, there were undoubtedly mentioned that they were undoubtedly members of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. The last good Democrat we ever had as president was JFK. No one else was as good as him. Still, Mama and Papa believed that hard work mattered more. They knew that life was a struggle, and through the odds were a bit longer for people like them. The fact didn't excuse failure. Never be like these fucking losers who think the deck is stacked against them, my grandma often told me. You can do anything you want to. Their community shared this faith, and in the 1950s, that faith appeared well-founded. Within 2 generations, the transplanted hillbillies had largely caught up to the native population in terms of income and poverty level, yet their financial success masked their cultural unease. And if my grandparents caught up economically, I wonder if they ever truly assimilated. They always had one foot in the new life and one foot in the old one. They slowly acquired a small number of friends but remained strongly rooted in their Kentucky homeland. They hated domesticated animals and had little use for critters that weren't for eating. Gosh. Yet they eventually relented to the children's demands for dogs and cats. Their children, though, were different. My mom's generation was the first to grow up in the industrial Midwest, far from the deep twangs and one-room schools of the hills. They attended modern high schools with thousands of other students. To my grandparents, the goal was to get out of Kentucky and give their kids a head start. The kids, in turn, were expected to do something with their head start. It didn't quite work out that way. Before Lyndon Johnson and the Appalachian Regional Commission brought new roads to southeastern Kentucky, the primary road to Jackson to Ohio was U.S. Route 23. So important was this road in the massive hillbilly migration that Dwight Yoakam penned a song about Northerners who castigated Appalachian children from learning the wrong 3 R's: reading, writing, Route 23. Yoakam's song about about his move from southeastern Kentucky could have come from Mama's diary. They thought reading, writing, Route 23 would take them to the good life that they had never seen. They didn't know that old highway would lead them to a world of misery. Mama and Papa may have made it out of Kentucky, but they and their children learned the hard way that Route 23 didn't lead where they hoped. And that was Chapter 2. I'm not sure if I should read through Chapter 3. Let me just see. So, 33... Chapter 3's not that long. I'll read it. Chapter 3. Mama and Papa had 3 kids. Jimmy, Bev, my mom, and Lori. Lori we heard of like once in the movie. Hold on. I can't do crisscross applesauce anymore. I gotta raise this up. Alright. Jimmy was born in 1951. When Mama and Papa were integrating into their new lives, they wanted more children. So they tried and tried through a heartbreaking period of terrible luck and numerous miscarriages. Excuse me. Mama carried, got a bubble in my neck. Mama carried the emotional scars of 9 lost children for her entire life. In college, I learned that extreme stress can cause miscarriages, and that this especially true. That this is especially true during the early part of a pregnancy. I can't help but wonder how many additional aunts and uncles I'd have today, were it not for my grandparents' difficult early transition. No doubt intensified by Papa's early years of hard drinking. Oh boy. Yet they persisted through a decade of failed pregnancies. Oh boy. And eventually it paid off. Mom was born on January 20th, 1961, the day of John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And my Aunt Lori came less than 2 years later. For whatever reason, Mama and Papa stopped there. JFK. The last great Democratic president. His vice president, who came after him, Lyndon, was not good. He caused the Vietnam War and a whole bunch of nonsense. just like another vice president who became president, Joe Biden. Uncle Jimmy once told me about the time before his sisters were born. We were just a happy, normal middle-class family. I remember watching Leave It to Beaver on TV and thinking that looked like us. When he first told me this, I nodded attentively. Yeah, I read that right. And left it alone. Looking back, I realized that to most outsiders, a statement like that must come off as insane. Normal middle-class parents don't wreck pharmacies because a store clerk is mildly rude to their child. But that's probably the wrong standard to use. Destroying store merchandise and threatening a sales clerk were normal to Mama and Papa. That's what Scots-Irish Appalachians do when people mess with your kid. What I mean is that they were united. They were getting along with each other, Uncle Jimmy conceded when I later pressed him. But yeah, like everyone else in our family, they could go from 0 to murderous in a fucking heartbeat. Yes, I am cussing. I'm just reading the book. This is just what the book says. This is how J.D. Vance worded it, because that's how they worded it. He's just saying it as it is. Okay? So, God forgive me for this. Alright? Whatever unity they possessed early in their marriage began to evaporate after their daughter Lori, whom I call Aunt Wee, was born in 1962. But in the mid-60s, Papa's drinking had become habitual. Mama began to shut herself off from the outside world. Neighborhood kids warned the mailman to avoid the evil witch of McKinley Street. Oh, when the I'm reading this wrong. Gosh, it's throwing me off so much. When the mailman ignored their advice, he met a large woman with an extra long menthol cigarette hanging out of her mouth, who told him stay the fuck off of her property. Hoarder and mentioned it hadn't entered every day. Poor Liz, but Mama fit the bill. And her tendencies only worsened as she withdrew from the world. Garbage piled in the house. Oh man, this is trading me with the whole stuff. With the entire bedroom devoted to trinkets and debris that had no earthly value. Like Sanford and Son. Oh hey, you don't get to see my reaction. Yes, I gotta do this. To hear of this period, one gets the sense that Mama and Papa had led two lives. There was the outward public life. It included work during the day and preparing the kids for school. This was the life that everyone else saw, and by all means, it was quite successful. My grandfather earned a wage that was almost unfathomable. To friends back home, he liked his work and did it well. Their children went to modern, well-funded schools. My grandmother lived in a home that was, by Jackson standards, a mansion. A 2,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms, and modern plumbing. That is a lot. 4 bedrooms. Home life was different. I didn't notice it at first as a teenager, Uncle Jimmy recalled. At that age, you're just so wrapped up in your own stuff that you hardly recognize the change. But it was there. Dad stayed out more. Mom stopped keeping the house. Dirty dishes and junk piled up everywhere. They fought a lot more, and it was all around a rough time. Hillbilly culture at the time, and maybe now, blended a robust sense of humor, devoted devotion to family, and bizarre sexism into a sometimes explosive mix. Before Mama was married, her brothers had been willing to murder boys who disrespected their sister. Now that she was married to a man who many of them considered more a brother than an outsider, their tolerated behavior had gotten that would have gotten Papa killed in the holler. Mom's brothers would come up and want to go carousing with Dad. I mean, I don't know. That behavior would have gotten Papa killed in the holler. Mom's brothers would have come up and want to go carousing with Dad, Uncle Jimmy explained. They'd go drinking and chasing women. Uncle Pet was always the leader. I didn't want to hear about it, but I always did. It was that culture from back then that expected the men were going to go out and do what they wanted to do. Mama felt disloyalty acutely. She loathed anything that smacked of a lack of complete devotion to family. In her own home, she'd say things like, "I'm sorry, I'm so damned mean," and "You know I love you, and I'm just a crazy bitch." Oh boy. Oh boy. Ugh. But she knew of anyone criticizing so much of her socks to an outsider, she'd fly off the handle. "I don't know those people. You never talk about family to some stranger. Never. My sister Lindsay and I could fight like cats and dogs in her home. And for the most part, she'd let us figure things out alone. If I had told a friend that my sister was hateful and Mama overheard, she'd remember it and tell me the next time we were alone that I had committed the cardinal sin of disloyalty. How dare you speak about your sister to some little shit? In 5 years, you won't even remember his goddamned name." Oh man, but your sister is the only true friend you'll ever have. Yet in her own life, with 3 children at home, the men who should have been most loyal to her, her brothers and husband, conspired against her. Papa seemed to resist the social expectations of a middle-class father, sometimes with hilarious results. He would announce that he was headed to the store and ask his kids if they needed anything. He'd come back with a new car. A new Chevrolet convertible one month, a luxurious Oldsmobile the next. "Where'd you get that?" they'd ask him. "It's mine. I traded for it," he replied nonchalantly. But sometimes his failure to conform brought terrible consequences. My young aunt and mother would play a little game when their mm, play a little game when their father came home from work. Sometimes he would carefully park his car, and the game would go well. Their father would come inside. They'd have dinner together like a normal family, and they'd make one another laugh. Many days, however, he wouldn't park his car normally. He'd park into a spot too quickly, or sloppily leave his car on the road, or even sideswipe a telephone pole as he maneuvered. Those days, the game was already lost. Mom and Aunt Wee would run inside to tell Mama that Papa had come home drunk. Oh, sometimes they'd run out of the back door and stay the night with Mama's friends. Other times, Mama would insist on staying, so Mom and Aunt Wee would brace for a long night. On Christmas Eve, Papa came home drunk and demanded a fresh dinner. When that failed to materialize, he would pick up the family Christmas tree and threw it out the back door. The next year, he greeted a crowd at his daughter's birthday party and promptly coughed up a huge wad of phlegm. I think that's how it's said. At everyone's feet. Then he smiled and walked off to grab himself another beer. I'm getting tired of reading. Oh, my heart. I couldn't believe that mild-mannered Papa, whom I adored as a child, was such a violent drunk, as his behavior was due at least partly to Mama's disposition. She was a violent non-drunk, and she channeled her frustrations into the most productive activity imaginable. Covert war. When Papa passed out on the couch, she'd cut his pants with scissors so they'd burst at the seam when he sat down. Or she'd steal his wallet and hide it in the oven just to piss him off. When he came home from work and demanded fresh dinner, she'd carefully prepare a plate of fresh garbage. If he was in a fighting mood, she'd fight back. In short, she devoted herself to making his drunken life a living hell. If Jimmy's youth shielded him from the signs of their deteriorating marriage for a bit, the problem soon reached an obvious nadir. Hang on. I am actually going to translate that since I don't know how to say that. Why is it going over there? I'm still here. Put my headphones on so I can hear. If it's nadir or nadir.
Nadir.
Nadir. Where was I? Uncle Jimmy recalled one fight. I could hear the furniture bumping and bumping. They were really getting into it. They were both screaming. I went downstairs to beg them to stop, but they didn't stop. Mama grabbed a flower vase, hurled it, and she always had a hell of an arm, hit Papa right between the eyes. It split his forehead wide open, and he was bleeding really badly, and he got in his car and drove off. That's what I went to school the next day thinking about. Yeah, that is not something you would want to think about. Mama told Papa about a particularly violent night of drinking that if he ever came home drunk again, she'd kill him. A week later, he came home drunk again and fell asleep on the couch. Mama never told ne- never one, Mama, never one to tell a lie, calmly retrieved a gasoline canister from the garbage, poured it all over her husband, lit a match, and dropped it on his chest. I remember that one scene from the movie when Lindsay explained that to JD when Papa burst into flames. Their 11-year-old daughter jumped into action to put out the fire and save his life. Miraculously, Papa survived the episode with only mild burns. Mild? Mild? How? Because they were hill people, they had to keep their two lives separate. No outsiders could know about the familial strife. Familial strife. That's how it's said. With outsiders defined very broadly. When Jimmy turned 18, he took a job at Armco and moved out immediately. Not long after he left, Aunt Wee found herself in the middle of one particularly bad fight, and Papa punched her in the face. The blow, though accidental, left a nasty black eye. When Jimmy, her own brother, returned home for a visit, Aunt Wee was made to hid in the basement. Because Jimmy didn't live with the family anymore, he was not to know about the inner workings of the house. That's just how everyone, especially Mama, dealt with things, Aunt Wee said. And it was just too embarrassing. Not obvious to anyone why Mama and Papa's marriage fell apart. It's not obvious to anyone why Mama and Papa's marriage fell apart. Perhaps Papa's alcoholism got the best of him. Uncle Jimmy suspects that he eventually ran around on Mama. Or maybe Mama just cracked with 3 living kids, one dead one, and a host of miscarriages in between. Who could have blamed her? Despite their violent marriage, Mama and Papa always maintained a measured optimism about their children's futures. They reasoned that if they could go from one-room schoolhouse in Jackson to a 2-story suburban home with the comforts of the middle class, then their children and grandchildren should have no problem attending college and acquiring a share of the American dream. They were unquestionably wealthier than the family members who had stayed in Kentucky. They visited the Atlantic Ocean and Niagara Falls as adults, despite never traveling farther than Cincinnati as children. They believed that they had made it, and that their children would go even further. There was even something deeply naive about that attitude, though. All 3 children were profoundly affected by their tumultuous home life. Papa wanted Jimmy to get an education instead of a full-time job out of high school. The money would be like a drug. It would feel good in the short term, but it would keep him from the things he ought to be doing. Papa even prevented Jimmy from using him as a referral on his Armco application. What Papa didn't appreciate was that Armco offered something more than money, the ability to get out of a house where your mother threw vases at your father's forehead. Lori struggled in school, mostly because she never attended class. Mama used to joke that she'd drive her to school and drop her off, and somehow Lori would beat her home. During her sophomore year of high school, Lori's boyfriend stole some PCP. Uh, I may not want to know what that is. Oh, that's the wrong key. Angel dust? Are you kidding me? Lord. Really? Really? Where was I? Something about PCP, I don't know. And the two of them returned to Mama's to indulge. He told me that he should do more, since he was bigger. That was the last thing I remembered. Lori woke up when Mama and her best friend Kathy placed Lori in a cold bathtub. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, wasn't responded. Kathy couldn't tell if the young man was breathing. Mama ordered her to drag him to the park across the street. I don't want him to die in my fucking house, she said. Oh. Instead, she called someone to take him to the hospital, where he spent 5 days in intensive care. The next year, at 16, Lori dropped out of high school and married. She immediately found herself trapped in an abusive home, just like the one she tried to escape. Her new husband would lock her in a bedroom to keep her from seeing her family. It was almost like a prison, Aunt Wee later told me. That is worse than prison. That is worse than prison. Last page. Fortunately, both Jimmy and Lori found their way. Jimmy worked his way through night school and landed a sales job with Johnson & Johnson. He was the first person in my family to have a career. By the time she turned 30, Lori was working... What time is it? Okay. Where was I? Lori was working in radiology and had such a nice husband that Mama told the entire family, if they ever get divorced, I'm following him. Unfortunately, the statistics caught up with the Vance family, and Bev, my mom, didn't fare so well. Like her siblings, she left home early. She was a promising student, but when she got pregnant at 18, she decided college had to wait after high school. After high school, she married her boyfriend and tried to settle down, but settling down wasn't quite her thing. She had learned the lessons of her childhood all too well. When her new life developed the same fighting and drama so present in her old one, Mom filed for divorce and began life as a single mother. She was 19 with no degree, no husband, and a little girl. My sister, Lindsay. Yeah, I thought Lindsay was older. Mama and Papa eventually got their act together. Papa quit drinking in 1983, a decision accompanied by no medical intervention and not much fanfare. Kind of like someone you see here. He quit drinking after a fatal accident he had in '99. As in fatal. They lost him twice on the way to the hospital. After that, he just then decided, right then and there, he's not drinking no more, he's not smoking anymore, and he's not doing cocaine, which apparently he did. Where was I? Oh yeah. He simply stopped and said little about it. He and Mama separated and then reconciled, although they continued to live in separate houses. They spent nearly every waking hour together, and they tried to repair the damage they had wrought. They helped Lori break out of her abusive marriage. They lent money to Bev and helped her with child care. They offered her places to stay. supported her through rehab, and paid for her nursing school. Most important, they filled the gap when my mom was unwilling or unable to meet the type of parent that they wished they'd been to her. Mama and Papa may have failed Bev in her youth, but they spent the rest of their lives making up for it. That was chapter 3. I'll read chapter 4 maybe tomorrow night. I don't know. Anyways, yeah. And I saw a sneak peek of chapter 4. Apparently the only person Papa voted for was Reagan. Which my Papa Heath also voted for. Though he's only voted Republican. He is a registered Democrat, but he has never voted Democrat in his life. He has only voted Republican in his life since '72 with Nixon. Nixon's second term, the one he won unanimously. And then Gerald Ford, Reagan twice, and then George W. Bush twice, then Bob Dole. Wait, George H.W. Bush I meant before. George W. Bush twice, and then McCain, Romney, and the greatest president this country's had, President Donald J. Trump. Anyways, yeah, that was chapter 2 and chapter 3. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you didn't, then why the hell are you watching this? Anyways, I would highly recommend you would have the book with you while I'm reading it. Or you have pages with you or something. Because I don't see how just listening to me is really helping. You know? I'm not sure if they offer all the pages online. $264. So yeah, I think later in the story it'll start talking about his side. His what is it? I forgot. His whole life growing up. Because he's only, like, talked about it a little bit. Alright. So, thank y'all for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever. Just don't try insulting me stupidly. Like people did after they saw my reaction to the election, which 45-47. Yeah. But that didn't really get to me. So anyways, thank y'all for watching. And I will see y'all next time. God bless.